like to ask everyone to take his or her seat, please. And if you could, Carolyn, could you close the door back there? Thank you. I understand the ambassador is in the building, but we're going to get started. So Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year, and good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Working Group on Christians and Religious Pluralism in the Middle East, which is a project of the Center for Religious Freedom here, I welcome you to the Hudson Institute and thank you all for coming and for our viewing audience for tuning in. We are celebrating today a critically important event that happened 20 years ago, the adoption into law of the International Religious Freedom Act. I was deeply engaged in that effort and can tell you that an uphill battle took place that required coalition building involving diverse religious groups across the political aisle. It also involved a cliffhanger of a legislative drama against powerful trade lobbies, political realists, and opposition from the administration, though President Clinton ultimately signed the bill. And we are honored to have speaking to us today the Honorable Frank Wolf, who served Virginia's 10th district in the U.S. House of Representatives for 35 years. He was the original sponsor of IRFA. Ambassador, welcome. Thank you. Before IRFA, religious freedom was a little, we used to say it was a little life raft off the island of human rights, which was itself off the mainland of U.S. foreign policy. And its great achievement was to institutionalize concern for religious freedom across the board for all groups within U.S. foreign policy. It created the ambassador at large position within the State Department and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And they monitor, report on, talk about, recommend, and make policy for the U.S. government. The Office of the Ambassador in USARF also annually points to the worst persecutors of the world, a short list of the world's worst religious persecutors. And we are very fortunate to have as our keynote speaker, Ambassador at Large Sam Brownback. Most of the commissioners with USARF, its executive director, Erin Shin-Suk, and most of the professional staff are with us today as well. Commissioner Christina Arriaga will be speaking, as will Katrina Lantos-Sweat and Elizabeth Perdomo and myself. All of us are former commissioners. The three of us are former commissioners, appointed by both Democrats and Republicans. The commission itself is an independent government agency that is bipartisan and multi-faith and no faith. And we will be hearing more about the law from our first panel, two authors of a new publication by 21st Wilberforce. But this event is not simply a retrospective. Several of our distinguished individual speakers will be addressing current crises in religious persecution and concerns that are on the horizon. Our second panel will address the Middle East, which has been a cultural and religious crossroads and is today the site of religious genocide against various groups and a devastating conflict and challenging recoveries from both. And I am deeply honored to announce that we have a surprise speaker, and that is Archbishop Warda, the Chaldean Diocese of Erbil in northern Iraq. And we will be hearing from him his message. Yes, thank you. And before we begin, the last thing, I want to thank our donor to today's event, Tawfiq Khoury. And I want to thank the sponsor of the new IRFA publication, the Religion News Foundation, which has made the publication available to us all afterwards as a gift. And Tom Gallagher, the CEO of the Religious News Foundation, will be our monitor today And yes, I thank him for joining us. It is now my honor to begin this program by welcoming a longtime friend, Ambassador Sam Brownback. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Nina. What a pleasure to be here. And 20 years later, I'm kind of thinking, it hasn't been 20 years, surely. I don't feel that much older. But I guess it's been at least 20 years, and it's been a good 20 years, although we got a lot of work yet to do. It'd probably be the summation of the whole. Thank you all for coming to this. I see around the room a number of people that have been around and working this topic for many years. Many of you more than 20 years have been deeply dedicated to this. I hope you feel as I do a moment that right now we've been I grew up on a farm. And one of the places we had these old pumps that you had to pump, and you had to prime the pump to get it to pump water up, to bring water up. Yeah, some of you, this will date some of you as well. This is an old pump. But it seemed like you just had to pump and pump and pump, and then finally the water would start coming out. I feel like we've been priming this pump for about 20 years, and the water's starting to come out, that it's really now starting to move. This is a top foreign policy issue for this administration. Trump administration is pushing this hard, pushing it aggressively. The president, the vice president's office, and I would give you just a case in point, Andrew Brunson, if you want to see one. This president took that case on like nobody has taken one of these cases on before, put tariffs on a NATO ally, which has never been done before, tanked their currency to record lows, and sat there until they let Andrew Brunson free. And they did. And thank you, yeah, he's free. He's here and he's back in the country. God bless President Trump for doing that and for leaning in. The Vice President's office has been singularly focused on this in many respects. Archbishop Warda here, the aid going into northern Iraq was announced by the Vice President, has been pushed by that office to target getting religious minorities to be able to resettle back into a particular area. And hundreds of millions of dollars are put in this in a new program that this has not been designed. These monies have not gone this way before. Frank Wolf and I both went to the region 1st of July. And it's been difficult, and you'll hear from the Archbishop, but some people are moving back. And this is one of the first times we're seeing people actually move back into a region in the Middle East where they had been driven out by ISIS in a genocide against Christians and Yazidis in northern Iraq. And if anybody needs to hear stories that are compelling, just listen to any of the people from that region that have been persecuted, a number of Yazidi women that Frank and I both met with that had been sold 5, 10 times, children taken out of their hands. One woman was there meeting with us saying she had a 15-year-old mentally retarded son that they beat her arms to get him out of, get him away from her so that he could be taken and she could be sold. And he's just saying, it was just the ugliest things that you can imagine. And unfortunately, those situations continue to exist in places around the world. It will continue to be a top priority of this administration, religious freedom. We did a ministerial this year, the first ever done on religious freedom. We had 84 countries participating. We had hundreds of people from civil society and religious groups there. We will do it again this next year, and soon the Secretary will announce the date for the next ministerial. My hope is that we triple the size of the civil society and religious component, and I believe we will with enough advance notice and a big enough room. Our limitation this time, where we had about 58 days on the notice, we didn't have a big enough room. We had more people committed to coming than we could house. Well, we're going to increase the size of the room this next year. But that, I think, is the unmet need there is in this space of religious freedom, and the desire and the willingness of people to fight for religious freedom for people all over the world. And the amount of persecution that's taking place. By Pew numbers, 80% of the world population lives in an area where there is significant religious persecution and lack of religious freedom. 80%. And that needs to stop. The religious freedom gates need to go open around the world, and the persecution, the iron curtain of religious persecution needs to come down. We will continue to push that. I mentioned the follow-on religious freedom ministerial. We'll do this next year, and we're working with 6 countries now to do regional religious freedom summits in various places around the world. The front end of those will soon be announced of the places. They'll each have different topics, but mostly be more regional focused, but pushing and promoting religious freedom around the world. The Religious Freedom Roundtable, a number of which people here today come regularly to it. Please attend if you can. It's regularly held on Tuesdays, 11 to noon, generally on Capitol Hill, where the topics are about religious freedom and in cases around the world. We had our first open one of those last week, where Brian Hook spoke about the lack of religious freedom in Iran. That was 2 weeks ago, and his speech got over 250,000 hits. About the topic of religious freedom or the lack thereof in Iran. We're working now to push more integrating religious freedom into other topics and places in Washington and in our aid community and other places. Particularly, we're working closely with AID, Agency for International Development. Their work in northern Iraq, as I've cited previously, is new, is groundbreaking, and we hope will be a new model for how to help a religious minority and help bring them back and allow them to go home to their home areas. We're working with groups to establish loan programs for religious minorities in various countries. Those are not done yet, but we hope that we're able to do those. And I was just in UAE last week speaking to an interfaith group, primarily of the Abrahamic faiths, together about religious freedom, talking about the dignity of every single human being, no matter who they are, no matter what they believe in. They are a beautiful, unique child of a loving God, period. It doesn't matter what they believe in. They're entitled to rights as a dignified human being. One of those, and a key one of those, being religious freedom. And that these are God-given rights that people are entitled to be able to use and to have and to exercise, and that no government has the right to interfere with those rights. And that was my message. I was also pushing and put forward that it's time, it's past time really, for the Abrahamic faiths to come together and renounce violence in the propagation of the faith, say we do not support, we renounce the use of violence to propagate the faith. And that it's past time as well that we call on the Abrahamic faiths to say no more killing done in the name of the God of Abraham. No more. It's past time. And this needs to be the clarion call of all of us. And what a gift we say to the world if the Abrahamic faiths come together and say, no more killing done in the name of the God of Abraham. And that was the message. And Sheikh Ben Bayef, that some of you have worked with, hosted this conference, and there were leading scholars and practitioners of all 3 Abrahamic faiths there in Abu Dhabi. Next, and I want to just conclude on this thought, is that this movement needs to go grassroots in this country. We're spreading out around the world, and we're going to get more countries engaged, and we clearly need to do that, and we've got a lot of work. To drive it from the United States, and I've been involved in several of these in the past, the movements have to go deep into the grassroots. We need to get churches, synagogues, mosques in this country engaged and invested. I saw a situation in northern Iraq where a parish in Arizona was helping to fund the rebuilding of some churches in a particular small area in northern Iraq. It's going, great. What a wonderful model for rebuilding and just networking those two together. But it also then deepens it into the beliefs of the people there in that parish, that I know now people who are being persecuted, but I'm helping to rebuild their lives in northern Iraq. And we've got situations around the world where that's the case, where we can help people, but we need to draw it grassroots and then project it out. The human trafficking movement's done a beautiful job of that, and this movement needs to do that now. And the people are in this room that can make that happen. And the organizations are in this room that can make that happen. To really drive it, it'll give it more political force in this country. It has a lot of political force. It'll give it even more. But it'll also network and put hearts together around the world of people persecuted. and that people can see and we can help. And one of the best things we possibly can do as a people is help those that are persecuted. This is just in all the religious traditions that I know of. Helping those that are downtrodden and persecuted is part of the calling. It's part of the belief. Let's exercise it. Let's do it. And let's give people the chance to be able to make that opportunity, those things happen. Most people will help if they just know how. And if they believe somebody on the other end is credible and it's not just throwing money, down a hole. They'll help. They'll do it. But they need somebody else to figure out, well, okay, how do I get it where? And are you sure it's going to go for a good cause? And if you can tell them, here's how you get it where, and yes, it is a good cause, and I'll prove it to you, or a bunch of you can come over here and we'll go do it together, they'll do it. So we need to make that happen. This is a moment we can make that happen. God bless all of you for being so involved in an important cause.
Mr. Wolf, will you please come to the podium? Frank Wolf, of course, represented the 10th District in Virginia for 34 years as a congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he was really a great son of Virginia. Virginia was, of course, where our Religious Freedom Amendment was incubated. Thomas Jefferson was so proud of it, he put it on his tombstone as one of his greatest achievements. And Frank is a personal hero of mine. He has been all over the world, tirelessly working on behalf of the persecuted. He's been to Perm 35 in the Soviet Union to visit Jewish refuseniks. He went to Sudan. He was one of the first members of Congress to go into Iraq after ISIS. And I particularly impressed with the fact, with the time that he went in disguise as a trekker into Tibet. So, and of course he is the sponsor of the International Religious Freedom Act 20 years ago. So join me in welcoming.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Nina. I'm going to thank Nina and Hudson for having this event. I also want to thank 21 Wilberforce and Luann Sabatier and Aaron Rodenwolf for the great report that they have done. I also want to thank all of you in the room who have been active in this issue and care deeply. Teddy Roosevelt said, "I believe the more you know about the past, the better you are prepared for the future." That's why what Lou and Aaron have done for the history is so important. Because you in this room are knowledgeable about international religious freedom, there's no need to tell you how bad things are around the world. The Bible has much to say about persecution, oppression, and ultimately freedom. In Luke 4, Jesus read from the prophet Isaiah saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, to release the oppressed." In Ecclesiastes 4:1 in the Old Testament, it said, "Again I looked. I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter." Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. I entered Congress on the coattails of Ronald Reagan, and have always been impressed by his leadership on issues of religious freedom. President Reagan said that the words in the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution were a covenant, not only with those gathered in Philadelphia in 1776 and 1787, but a covenant with the people around the world, a covenant with the Catholic nun or the Catholic priest in Iraq, a covenant with a Protestant pastor jailed in China, a covenant with a Uyghur Muslim child in a Chinese re-education camp, a covenant with the Nigerian Chibok girls who are still, at this very moment we're here, being held by Boko Haram 4 years after that. As I travel, I have found that the words of the Declaration of Independence are known by people around the world. I believe that this covenant has been weakened, and as Ambassador Brownback said, needs to be reestablished and strengthened. and thinking about where we are 20 years after the passage of the IRFA legislation, here are some of my personal thoughts that I believe can be done to reestablish and strengthen the covenant. Each could be the subject of its own discussion, but I will briefly mention each recommendation. Number one, work as quickly as possible in the new Congress with Senator Rubio and Congressman Chris Smith and others on the reauthorization of IRFA and strengthen it in ways that many of you in this room think necessary. Two, as we move ahead to keep the issue bipartisan, it is still one of the few issues that is seen as nonpartisan. In the House, we have members like Congressman Chris Smith, a Republican, and Jim McGovern, a Democrat, both who have been outstanding on this issue. Keep this issue bipartisan. Thirdly, encourage the newly elected members of the House and Senate who are to be involved in this issue as they move forth in their congressional careers. Ambassador Brownback can tell you that history shows that the issues a member adopts early are issues that they stay with. Sometimes a member we think would be the least interested turns out to be the most interested because of some experience in their lifetime that we know nothing about. So we need to get together and have religious freedom advocates meet with all the new members of the House, both House and Senate, and it should be done very early in the new session. Number four, set up a series of briefings on international religious freedom early in the new Congress on the Hill for staff of both new and returning members of the House and Senate. Briefings should be done at least every other month. Personally, I think it should be every month, but at least every other month. And efforts made to encourage Hill staffers to attend. Alternate the briefings between the House and the Senate. Number five, there needs to be a major effort, as Mr. Brownback was saying, the ambassador, on the college campuses to make international religious freedom compelling to students, similar to what IJM has done on the issue of sexual trafficking. Pew Research has found that 2 in 3 young people brought up as Christians disengage from their faith between the ages of 18 and 29. The likelihood of these people being engaged or even interested in international religious freedom is very low unless something is done. 6, there are major law firms and public relation groups working against what all of you in this room are trying to accomplish to help the persecuted. Just one example is a major law firm that is representing China, which is persecuting every religious group, including detaining young Muslim children in re-education camps, reminiscent of Mao and Stalin. And I have seen bringing about cultural genocide in Tibet. Imagine a Buddhist monk who is in the Dropsy prison and they hear that American law firm is representing the Chinese government. This law firm also represents Saudi Arabia, which publishes anti-Christian and anti-Semitic textbooks and is involved in reprehensible activities. This law firm also represents President Bashir of Sudan, who is an indicted war criminal for genocide and has bombed African villages, killing women and children. The activity of these firms cannot be ignored. We need to speak out against them. I'm reminded of the words of Reverend Martin Luther King, who said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Are we not the friends? Then we should speak out against these groups in town that are working against the very thing that each and every person in this room is working on. And after speaking out about lobbying and influencing for abusive federal governments and foreign governments, I asked the question, is it appropriate for the Washington Post and other major newspapers to print and distribute as inserts in their own paper, China Daily, which is controlled by the Chinese government and are registered as a foreign agent under the Foreign Registration Act? I think not. The Washington Post editorial page has been great. I love Fred Hyatt. He's got a heart for these things he cares. Is it appropriate to carry this insert in the paper? 7, establish a religious freedom defense fund similar to what Bob Fu is doing for China. to help lawyers in countries all over the world to defend those persecuted for the faith by training and funding these lawyers. Dissidents all over the world need lawyers to represent them. This could be done in cooperation with the American Bar Association, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Christian Legal Aid Society, and other legal groups. It is important to help these lawyers. The lawyer for Asia Bibi needed help. There are Asia Bibis all over the world, and these lawyers need help. Number 9, Christian leaders ought to speak out publicly and work against anti-Semitism. We see anti-Semitism growing in many countries and even on American college campuses. Over much of the world's history, Jews have suffered betrayal, scorn, and persecution. A Jewish friend of mine told me that no survey was needed to determine whether a country was free. He said simple visits to synagogues did the job. As history has shown, if the Jews of a country were free to practice their faith, one could be reasonably confident that tolerance and freedom were possible for others. I think the Christian church needs a Bonhoeffer initiative. Last night I read more about Bonhoeffer and coming on the subway today. We need a Bonhoeffer initiative in the Christian church. Number 10, and the last and I believe the most important recommendation, is that the church needs to engage boldly in the issue of international and I believe also personally domestic religious freedom. I believe that with some exceptions, it is not. One of the most powerful pieces of writing in modern times is the Reverend Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. He said, so often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. Reverend King went on to say, and I quote, he said, the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. He said, if today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning. But waiting for the right time to act is not an option. This is the right time to act. As we look at all the persecution taking place of all faiths, as Ambassador Brownback said, around the world, are we who consider ourselves men and women of faith in 2018 more cautious than courageous? As we speak out and engage on behalf of the persecuted, are we willing to risk imprisonment for what we believe? In the Bible, we see it as common for those who follow God to end up in jail. Joseph, Daniel, John the Baptist, the Apostle Paul, all were jailed for what they believe. I was told that when World War I German hero Martin Niemöller was imprisoned by the Nazis, a fellow pastor came to visit him. The pastor asked how a man in Niemöller's statue could be in a place like that. Niemöller reportedly replied, quote, the question isn't how I could be here, but why aren't you here too? These are profound questions of conscience, which every man and woman must answer for themselves. And I believe that we in the West will find ourselves better able to count the cost, as it were, the more intimately acquainted we are with the persecuted brothers and sisters abroad. And if we know their stories, if we weep at their wounds, if we intercede on their behalf through prayer and advocacy, I'm confident that we will find ourselves shaped by the courage. When I'm out there sometimes with these people, the courage you get from them, we will shape by the courage of these men and women as they become more than faceless and nameless victims in distant places and hard-to-pronounce prison cells. And if we're clear-eyed about the times in which we live, I believe these encounters will make our own faith more robust and strengthen us for the days ahead. We need more Dietrich Bonhoeffers. We need more Martin Luther Kings. We need more Thomas Moores. we need more William Wilberforces. What remains to be seen is whether men and women of faith and others of goodwill will accept this challenge, regardless of where it leads them. As anti-Nazi pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, we are not to simply banish the wounds of the victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. Advent is a season of expectant waiting for the coming of Jesus, who cared about the poor, the imprisoned, and the oppressed. Rich in spiritual meaning for believers the world over. And my prayer this Advent season is that the suffering church would no longer suffer alone, that we would stand with them, and we would seek a day when, in the words of the beloved Christmas hymn that we'll all be singing, O Holy Night, all oppression shall cease. Thank you very much.
Truly inspirational. Thank you, Honorable Wolf. And thank you, Ambassador. Yes, blessings on your work. So we're going to start with our first panel, and Tom Gallagher will be our moderator. And Tom, you are the CEO of Religion News Foundation, which has sponsored the publication that is being made available today. Aaron.
Good morning, good afternoon. Are you two all set?
Set? Can you hear me? Set, Lou? I'm set.
We're here.
All right, good.
We're set.
Before we begin, I'd like to say that I was in Abu Dhabi last week and heard Ambassador Brownback's speech, and it was an outstanding speech, so you should be congratulated. The reason we're gathered here today is to celebrate the publication of the 20th anniversary of the International Religious Freedom Act, a retrospective. After today's presentation, all of you will receive a copy. So I'd like to introduce the authors of this book. Aaron Rodewald is the editor at 21 Wilberforce, and Luann Sabatier is also the director of communications at 21 Wilberforce. So I'm going to jump in and offer a question, and you both can answer, or either one of you can answer by yourself. Given that 2018 is the 20th anniversary of the International Religious Freedom Act, it certainly makes sense to step back and to reflect on how the act has been implemented these past 20 years. And so the question I have is, for both of you, is what is the value of producing this book at this time?
I think to follow up on Ambassador Brownback and Frank, the publication wasn't written for anyone in this room. The publication was written for the people outside of Washington and the policy centers, on universities and places of faith. We're storytellers. And this is a story that has not been told, or let me just say updated. So our purpose was to create a resource and a tool that is engaging, that is factual, and that will be adopted by universities as a teaching supplement and in synagogues and places of faith to really bridge out, because movements start not only with policy, but they start with people on the ground. And they always ask, what can we do? How can we engage? And so what we're doing is giving them a little bit of a bridge.
Aaron would like to add to that?
Sure. So I would say that the way we approached the publication was we really wanted a conversation starter. We wanted this to be context for folks to be able to understand what's happened and what's come before, so that they can take it to the next step. One of the folks that we interviewed, she said, now's not the time to take our foot off the gas. And that's very true. I mean, the ambassador alluded to the problems that are around the world in terms of the number of people who are pressed for their beliefs, There's a lot of work yet to be done, but there's tremendous work that's come before, and to understand that and to understand the context was important for us.
So you've answered a little bit of the second question, that is, what is your hope for the publication and what the audience is? If you look out a year from now or 2 years from now, what would success look like as a result of this publication?
How about, let's say 60 days? Okay, so we're short-term and long-term. We're already adopted into 5 universities.
And what does that mean exactly?
Adopted meaning they're finding it credible and they're going to use it as a teaching supplement in their foreign policy and national security courses. Elizabeth has invited us up to Tufts to speak at the Fletcher School, Yale. We're also working hopefully with Biola and Baylor, and Congressman Wolf, Frank, is introducing us into Christian colleges and universities. Success would be within the first 60 days that we have at least 40 colleges and universities using this as a context, as a supplement. And long term, that out of that, people who had no idea what has happened or why. When Frank said, we need to rise up Thomas More's, we need to rise up William Wilberforce's, 2 out of 3 lose their faith. Well, let's go where they are. We have to meet people where they are. So let's go into the universities, and that's our hope.
Aaron, anything?
I would just add that here in Washington, I'm from Los Angeles, so I'm on that other side of the planet. International religious freedom, everybody in this room, you're very aware of what's going on. And in DC, there's a lot happening. There's the Earth Roundtable. There's just a lot of activity. But there's a big, wide country out there, and I would hope that this publication will help to get outside of that Washington bubble and bring in some of the other folks that, as the ambassador said, if you give them some direction, if you tell them how to do something, there are people out there who really want to get involved. And this is one step to do that.
So let's take a minute and dig into the publication. So as part of your work, you interviewed at least 50 people for this publication, senators, representatives, the IRF ambassadors, the commissioners, various advocates. Can you share with the audience some colorful stories you learned along the way? And especially those that you didn't put in the book.
Well, we will say we felt like we went to MBA School of International Religious Freedom, but it is over 750 hours of testimony and interviews and books, and I'll let Aaron kick off. The challenge was twofold. Not what's more important, but how do you take this entire landscape that's been very complicated and amazing people, and in a short amount of space, what stories do you tell? But I'll let Aaron start. There were some moments.
Well, you have all the juicy ones.
No.
I'll let you have it. I think one of the things that I walked away from doing this experience with was how many people from different walks of life are really interested in this topic. Not just as a topic, but it's a heart topic. Academics, congressmen, senators, NGOs. We just did everything that we could to make sure we covered a lot of different groups. I think one of the best things is that we were able to talk to each and every one of the ambassadors for international religious freedom and get their perspective at that level, but then also to be able to reach down and talk to some folks at the grassroots level, so important for what we're going to do moving forward.
I would say that what's so amazing, and there's someone in this room who is very dear to me. I did not meet her till today, but she left quite an impression. And when I brought, and she's in the book, but when I brought up her role, there's not a person in this room except for Tom Farr who knew who she was. And that's a little bit like the George Bush quote. What was it about the road to humility is not very busy? And she's just so humble and was so behind the scenes in Congress for many years, sowing some seeds on the Lantos Commission, and then at the state, which a lot of people thought was hostile territory. But it was such a lesson for me that God will put people right in the middle of it. And if I could, I would not, we normally don't do this, but I would like to recognize and ask her to stand, Alex Arriaga. And when I would mention even to Professor George or Katrina, they're like, you mean Christina Arriaga? I said, oh, she's a force too. But there's another Arriaga. So why do I say that? This is a very rich, deep story, and all of you participated. Even Sharon Pate, our executive director, she said, why are you interviewing that person? I said, it could be because he made the call that got the bill through the Senate. And she kind of laughed. She said, I had no idea. That's the point. This is not, we're not making it up. We are not editorializing. Many of you have no idea how many, they say it takes I mess this up all the time, takes a village to raise a kids or something like that. I don't know. But I'm not trying to be funny. I mess those up all the time. But it really did. And so the value is not stroking egos, but really the story is richer. Yeah. And one thing, Aaron,
I was just going to say, when you do get the publication, and you'll get a copy as you leave today, there are sections in there we wrestled with, gosh, how do we tell some of the kind of tangential stories? Because we wanted to keep moving forward on the timeline. There's a lovely timeline at the bottom of it that keeps you kind of, where you are in a space of time. But we wanted to capture a few of these stories. So in the publication, there's different areas that are called Earth Voices. And those are some of the more color that you'll see.
For instance, Elliot Abrams told a great story. He said, and Tom Farr was there, and we actually found a picture of Elliot Abrams the month that he said that. He said, he and Bob Seipel, they show up, and he goes, we had a phone, a vacuum cleaner. We didn't even have a desk. He said, we had a vacuum cleaner. And he said, so you want to talk about changing the world? We couldn't even get a phone line. So we had some colorful stories, but, seriously, Mighty Midland. And I know Sam had to go because Ambassador Brownback, he's preparing for something very important tomorrow. And we talked to him about that. He was there. He and Frank were there. Never underestimate a story. You can have a bill, you can have a lobby. Deborah Fikes, who many of you know, and I know she was just in Dubai with you, she was a keynote speaker in Dubai, was a housewife in Midland, Texas. And her husband was a $5 a month donor to Voice of the Martyrs. And she saw the magazine, this is a true story, coming in every month, and she said, Lou, I would read the stories, and all of a sudden, one day, it just, like my heart was pricked, and it's like, he can donate, I need to do something. Well, it just so happened her best friend was from Midland, and that was President Bush. Oh. And she said, I was a housewife with 3 kids. I've never been an advocate in my life, but I had the President of the United States on my side. And Midland, and you were there, Faith McDonald. And they did, for Sudan, Rock the Vote. The first year, 34,000. The second year, Midland, Texas, 100,000 people showed up. And they did a mock. We have pictures in the book. My point in telling this is, where's the rest of the Midlands? You talk about movements. We need to quit saying the church needs to rise up, okay? That's at the 50,000-foot level. Let's go into Paducah, Kentucky. Let's give them some examples so when they read about Mighty Midland, they can say, I'm in Bloomington, Indiana. I can do that. So what we're doing is modeling in a way that is engaging, hopefully, that will perk up. Because we use this language, the church and grassroots. We need to stop, get those out of it. The church is made up of people of faith.
So Luann, how do you feel about that?
Well, I want to say, you kidded me when we came on, and I said, like George Bush, I go at 2 speeds, warp and sleep.
Yes, I see. As a retrospective.
That's why I'm here, because I just keep her.
A little balance. Congressman Wolf offered up some ideas about how to amend the act in the days ahead. But as a retrospective, can you share a few themes that came out of the process of getting this act to a positive outcome 20 years ago?
It was messy, but that's what our system is supposed to be. And sometimes out of the messiest things comes the endurance, and that's what we have 20 years later. And we just went through a year and a half ago the Frank R. Wolf Act, which fortified what happened 20 years ago. So I think as far as process goes, it went the way it was supposed to go. And the people involved felt strongly enough about it that they believed it to their core, and they wrote it through, and we got what we have. It's a great study for talk about on the college campuses, not just for understanding international religious freedom, but for understanding how our democratic process works. And in fact, a few of the folks who have seen this early on, that's one of the things we've heard. This is our process at work, and wow, I didn't know that, as you mentioned earlier, Lou. So I think that for those reasons, it will be a good tool to take into the colleges to understand just how you can turn something that's difficult and hard into something that's enduring and important.
And Luann, what advice would you give the new Congress coming in? If you think back 20 years ago, what worked, what would you give advice to the Congress as they look at this act?
I don't think I'm in a position to give advice to Congress, but I would give. No.
If you were asked.
No, but I would, I think they mentioned, I would give advice to their staff, and we have some in our audience and some who, all of you, some of your paths started out, is I worked on, Lindsay Vesey was the original creator. I'm the creator of the International Religious Freedom Congressional Scorecard that we introduced 2 years ago. And the congressmen are important, but more important are the 1,500 Hill staffers I keep in constant contact with. They are the voice and the ears, and they write the speeches, and they have their attention. And I think it's respecting, not out of disrespect, but respecting those offices and those individuals and making them feel worthy and that they make a difference and learning to work with them. I think it's hugely important. So we're hoping with this publication to do a listening session with them so they'll understand what's happened.
So a couple final questions before we wrap up. Were there any individuals you couldn't get into the publication because of scheduling conflicts and you'd wished you'd interviewed? And if so, do you have an example or two?
Yeah, I think we were really fortunate to have such a broad section of folks, but I think we both would agree it would have been terrific to have included Secretary Albright in our conversation. We just could not get that on the schedule. I think Dan Coates would have been another excellent person who had a pivotal and not always known role. Those are two.
I mean, I'm sure there are many that we missed, but those were two, and not for lack of trying, but it just didn't work out.
Now, all of you will get a copy at the end of this session today, but it's been given out to a handful of people. So what's been the early response to your book?
I think we gave it to people who aren't in our world. All of them came back and said, we have two goals. We have a goal of discovery, and our goal is to make them curious. So we're a path in, and I want to honor all of you. I can't even call out names, but from Nina and Tom Farr, and we talked to all of them, and Alan Hertzke, and from the USURF staff. By the way, Dwight introduced me to Alex, Dwight Bashir from USURF. It became a journey, and we went down the hole. But I think the important thing is we have the books. We've got the teachers. We just need something that the students would pay attention to.
And in closing, any final thoughts?
You know, we go around the world outside of Wilberforce, and I train journalists and people in religious freedom, and it's called Tell a Story, Change the World. And I just returned from Kenya and had 19 nations there. And as I was telling the story, some of the work going on in Nigeria, Uganda stood up. Australia stood up. They all stood up and said, I want in. And it taught me, you know, I can give you the facts. If I give you the facts, it's an essay. If I give it some emotion and some photographs, it becomes a story. And it makes all your work much more accessible. So I would just say to Aaron, you know, our goal is not to belittle. Our goal is not to entertain. Please do not underestimate that. But it is to make it accessible.
Accessible, I'll tell how I met you. I live in Los Angeles, raised a family, own a PR firm with my husband, and my heart was captured by this topic. And I saw what 21 Wilberforce was doing, and so I sent a letter and, had a perfunctory response, and then I get this phone call one day, and it's Lou Sabatier on the phone. I'm director of communications, and she's talking a mile a minute, and I just love you. And I'm like, who is this person? And she said, you have some skills I think we can use. It took somebody to say, you have some skills I think we could use, or to recognize that person in Seattle or in Fresno, California, or wherever it might be, to say, yeah, we don't just need a check from you. We want to use your skill, and we want to include you in the movement. There are so many people who really want to be involved. They're just looking for you to open the door. And hopefully this publication will give us another way to make that happen.
And we want to also thank, because something that has never happened, this is a little minor, but all the commissioners, some of you don't know, they're so supportive, not only what they do, but people getting this project, that they moved their meeting upstairs so they could all be here. Would you all stand, please, so we can recognize you, the USERF commissioners? So we're just grateful. But I can tell you, in Trafalgar, Indiana, they don't know what a USERF commissioner is. So case in point, that hopefully we can shed some light on that. Thank you, Tom.
Wonderful. Congratulations. Thank you. Nina will now introduce our guest speaker.
It's our pleasure to have Archbishop Warda with us today. He is the Archbishop of the Chaldean Catholic Diocese in Erbil, and he woke up one morning in the summer of 2014 and found 70,000 Christians, Yazidis, and Sunnis on his doorstep, and they didn't leave for 4 years. He was totally unprepared for this responsibility, but he took it up with great faithfulness and patience. He's a stalwart. He has been a stalwart pastor and on the front lines of religious genocide for these years. And he has also been a visionary, constantly thinking up new ways to keep the Christian community of Nineveh, this ancient 2,000-year-old community, intact and in place, to let them know that they have a home in his diocese. And so please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Nina. I come from Iraq, from a country which suffers a memory crisis, or there is what we call disease in the memory. And just to speak of the modern history of Iraq, in 1948, when the Jewish were one of the most historical components of the Iraqi society, were expelled, none of the Iraqi people have asked what we are going to lose. What we are going to lose if we allow this. And in fact, we've lost a lot. We've lost a lot. We've lost one of the most important components of the Iraqi society. We've lost art, poems, and you could tell. And the cycle went on, then the Kurds were expelled, and the Shia were expelled. And in 2003, the American presence did not help a lot healing this crisis, where the Sunni and Shia got in a war together in a sectarian violence. We, Christians and Yazidis, paid the price. And everyone was watching that something is going wrong, and no one was really acting to stop this until we all realized that something should be done. Something should be done, and speaking not just about the persecution, but also how we could really build a future for all Iraqis. Today, I would say we have to learn from the past, but learning about the past means to have also some plans for the future. And when it comes to Iraq, which it is a country I care about, because I would like to see my people stay, not just to survive, but to thrive. We are not there just like passing days and waiting for something to happen. We are there to contribute, and we could contribute a lot. Over 1,400 years living with Islam, we have contributed a lot. We taught Muslims philosophy. We translated the philosophical text from Greek to Syriac to Arabic, and you could tell a lot of these examples. Going to the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 12, when Jacob was beheaded and Peter was imprisoned, the whole community gathered to pray for the persecuted disciples. I think it's your responsibility today not just to pray for the persecuted Christians and other religious around the world, but also to help. And today you have a historical moment. There is a bill which is going to be signed by the President, HR 390, which would recognize that what happened to the Christians and Yazidis is an act of genocide. And you need to act and help. Not just help, but to call the people accountable, the people who are responsible for this genocide accountable. If you could help us implementing this, you are going really to treat the disease, to heal the memory, because this cycle of violence will be stopped. Once you call the people responsible for what happened, this is really an act, a courageous act, would be done for the first time and would contribute in healing the past and the memory of the Iraqi society, and would give hope also to all the children of Iraq, Christian, Yazidis, Shia, Sunni, could tell many of them, which is a richness, give them a hope that you are in a safe hand. So from here, I would ask you, please work hard to implement HR 390, because there are some courageous people worked hard for 2 years for this bill to come. Thank you very much for your faith and for your support. Thank you.
Okay, so now we move on to our second panel, and Tom, there's Tom. And I'd like to ask all the panelists to come forward, please. I think we have all chairs here. We have more than enough.
Okay. You want me to take one
If you
down?
want, whatever you want to do.
Dee, I hope we can talk.
So, Nina, do you want us? Order? Simple. Let's see.
Okay, so the order here is wrong.
Oh, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. My fault. The mic is on, so we can talk about anything.
There we go. So, Luann and Aaron, thank you very much for your retrospective and your. There you go. Thank you. Get our mic check here. I think we're all set. Great. So, Aaron and Luann, thank you very much for your retrospective. The book itself gave us a chance to look backwards and to think about what was successful, how the act came about. And now this panel will look to the present and to the future and offer some suggestions on how to move forward. In 2016, I had an opportunity to go to Iraq to report in Erbil the plight of the displaced Christians in Yazidis. And so I can attest firsthand of the hard work that Archbishop Warda is doing in that region. It seems like you've turned into a lobbyist, but we need your advocacy here in Washington, so thank you. The topic of this panel is contemporary issues with respect to religious genocide and persecution. So what do we know? Ambassador Brownback and Congressman Wolf have described the various persecutions of religious minorities around the world, in China, in Myanmar, and elsewhere. But when we look at this topic, we always come back to the Middle East. That seems to be the fault line for religious persecution and genocide. And so the U.S. government is correct to focus on other parts of the world, but we still need to continue to focus on the Middle East. So let me introduce the panelists. And as you know, Nina Shea is to my right. She's a senior fellow and director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. She also co-chairs the Institute's working group on Christians and religious pluralism in the Middle East. Elizabeth Perdomo is the working group's other co-chair. Christina Arriaga is the vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Hillel Franklin is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World at the Hudson Institute, and founder and co-editor of Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. And last but not least is Paul Marshall, a senior fellow of the Center for Religious Freedom here at the Hudson Institute, and a distinguished senior fellow at the Institute for the Study of Religion at Baylor University. So Nina, each panelist will have 3 minutes to offer their comments and perspectives, and then we'll ask them questions. So Nina, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. Religious genocide by ISIS was formally declared by the U.S. government, and it's really the first time since the Darfur genocide that there has been one declared. This is the most heinous of all. Genocide is the most heinous of all human rights violations. And after the Jewish Holocaust, the world vowed never again. But it happens again, it did happen again, and it happens again and again. And so I am going to look at what are some of the lessons learned from what happened in Iraq and Syria when ISIS attacked. And the first lesson is to recognize the need to recognize the early warning signs of genocide. After the U.S. invasion in 2003, until ISIS showed up in 2014, 90% of the Mandaean population was wiped out. They were mostly driven out by terror, targeted at them. The Christians, about 2/3 of them were driven out. Killed or driven out. And this happened silently, quietly, through family by family abductions, holding hostages for ransom, and terror, again, targeting these very vulnerable minorities. The U.S. second lesson is that even after ISIS was defeated thanks in large part to the US military and the coalition. The aftermath of the genocide then stopped, the violent aspect of it, but it continued in the sense that there was no international aid reaching these minorities. There was actually, it's unconscionable, but there was a US and UN policy basically to not take them into consideration, their situation of survivors of genocide into consideration. So they were left out of the food policies day to day. They did not, month to month, did not get food delivered. Archbishop Warda did not have the UN delivering food or medicine to his camps that he established. There were no camps set up for Christians at all that survived this, and not enough for the Yazidis. So that aid policy changed with the speech by Vice President Pence in October last year, but it was not enough to announce a new policy because the policy was not implemented. What has happened recently is that there was an appointment of an interagency coordinator, and he happens to be one of our members of our working group, Max Primorak. He is over there in Iraq. He is doing this interagency coordination, and he is empowered to have a direct line to the vice president and to the aid director, Mark Green. This is making a huge difference. Aid is beginning to flow in this region, and it's only begun to flow in the last couple months. So ISIS attacked, to recap, ISIS attacked in the summer of 2014. Genocide was declared by the US government in March 2016 by the Obama administration. Summer of 2017, ISIS was defeated in the Nineveh region. October 17, Vice President Pence promises aid, and then finally, not until 4 years after the genocide, October and November 2018, the first aid starts arriving to help these, in a consistent, massive basis to help these people and to help these most vulnerable people, the survivors of genocide, the Christians and the Yazidis, and to help them to go back to their homes at this point. And that my last point, just make very quickly, is that the minorities in situations where there is a power vacuum, where there is a conflict in this region, will be targeted, not just caught in the middle, not just collateral damage, but they will be targeted for elimination. And they have been protected in the past by Britain and France, or by secular strongmen, and they need protection again. There's a very critical need at this point as Iran encroaches, as ISIS is regrouping. We learned recently for their security and protection, and the U.S. should be pressed to come up with a plan for that. The UN is not going to do it. And this is part of the National Security Strategy Report of this administration to defend the persecuted minorities. So that's all I'll say for my opening.
Thanks, Nita. Elizabeth?
Great, thank you. Thank you to all the Hudson organizers. Thank you to 21 Wilberforce, and it's a pleasure to meet you. I hope I won't be told to be quiet in our first interaction.
Your time's up.
I think I just took up your time.
That's okay. That's
Sorry.
Okay. I'll speak as quickly as I can, and thank you to Archbishop Warda for being with us. I wanted to remind us how appropriate it is that we're actually having this event today. It's not only to memorialize the release of the book, but today is also the 70th anniversary of the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as we all know, the UDHR was passed to help us do what we're trying to today, to remember, to see, and to ensure, therefore, through action, that never again would we have genocide. And there had already been 2 genocides by that time in the 20th century. The first Ottoman genocide against Armenian, Greek, and Syriac Christians, and then the Shoah, the Holocaust against Jews in Europe, 6 million of them. And unfortunately, we're here 70 years later, and 20 years after the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act, and as Nina and others have so compellingly pointed out, we're still seeing genocide around us. I'd like to say a little bit about a phenomenon that is oftentimes accompanies genocide, but is oftentimes less seen, less discussed, and therefore less acted on. And by that, I would like to talk about nonviolent mechanisms of discrimination that actually end up producing the same outcome as pogroms and systemic violence that we recognize quite easily as genocide. And I want to say a little bit about those nonviolent mechanisms because I think they're very pernicious and corrosive. And again, as I said, they produce the same sorts of outcomes, which are the homogenization of populations in the Middle East that have been plural for thousands and thousands of years. And they produce, cleansing and forgetting. So I want to just highlight some of those nonviolent mechanisms because I think it's there that we need to see more, we need to speak more, and we need to act more. The first is educational policy, the use of textbooks, teachers, and curricula, public education and religious education to exclude populations or to send messages that they don't belong and therefore that they can be attacked and eliminated. The second is property rights regimes, discriminatory property rights regimes that target individuals and communities in terms of their right to own, protect, sell, inherit property, to create, in other words, economic disenfranchisement. And that produces migration that oftentimes falls under the generic and sterile term of voluntary migration. It's not voluntary. The third is the destruction and the appropriation of sites, religious and cultural heritage. That includes monuments, it includes religious worship sites, it includes texts and artifacts, everything by which populations live, but also that we remember that they once were. And after all, genocide experts and legal scholars know that the final stage of genocide is denial, and memoricide is a form of denial. Two more points, nonviolent mechanisms. The use of citizenship and residency requirements to differentiate status of individuals and communities before the law, using the law, in other words, to politically disenfranchise and message that it's open season on certain populations and that perpetrators can act with impunity. And then finally, I would say speech issues and the use again of speech laws and limitations on free speech in order to silence individuals within minority or demographic minority communities, but also to silence debate within religious majority communities. These are all forms of discrimination, religious discrimination, and they are the handmaidens of the pogroms and episodic violence and mass violence that we associate with genocide. We need to recognize them, we need to raise our voices against them, and we need to ensure that on this kind of an anniversary, maybe we'll be talking about something different in another year. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Christina?
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. I see so many faces in the room that I've known for over 20 years. Some of you, like Hillel, could tell some stories about me. He's not going to tell them. That's why he laughed nervously.
Later, outside.
Later. I do want to point out to Luan Sabatier that I was the other Arriaga for many years. Alex Arriaga was a hero of mine, and she was featuring Vogue magazine at one point when she was on the Hill, and she was at Amnesty International. She's been someone who's been involved, so it's a great honor for me to share her last name, but we're not related. We tried, maybe in the back. So I am the Vice Chairwoman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, one of two. The other Vice Chairwoman is here, Gail Manchin, and our Chairman is here, Tenzin Dorji. And I was asked to look ahead on what we're doing. As you know, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom is a body comprised of 9 private sector unpaid part-time volunteers that lead a staff of about 20 professionals who are experts on their issue. Our big product is an annual report that is mandated by Congress, but we also have reports on other issues. So the report that just came out is a report on Saudi Arabia textbooks. It's actually quite shocking and inexcusable that we have been following this issue for 15 years and the Saudi Arabian government continues to print books that have terrible statements about other religions, about the Shia Muslims, about Jews, about women, about the LGBTQ community. And we have found that these textbooks are not only in Saudi Arabia, but in fact, they're distributed around the world. In 2008, USERV discovered that these textbooks were being used here in Fairfax, Virginia. And in 2010, the BBC reported that 40 private Muslim schools were showing their 15-year-old diagrams on how to cut someone's hand if they did not obey Sharia. There were also very explicit sections on how to kill someone from the LGBTQ community. Unfortunately, even though USERV conducted 2 trips to Saudi Arabia recently, and we were told that this was no longer in existence, we surveyed 22 textbooks for middle school and high school kids with, hitting your wife is only permitted when necessary. That's comforting to know. This is some of the lesser passages. I invite you to read the report. Of 3,000 pages that were reviewed, only 2 were found only 2 passages were found to encourage religious tolerance. We are at a point in our relationship with Saudi Arabia that maybe we can inspire them to remove these from the textbooks and also recall the tens of thousands of textbooks that they have distributed around the world, and they're everywhere from Australia and Austria to Yemen. I highly recommend the report. We have other super fascinating reports on userv.gov, and if you have any questions afterwards, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Hillel?
Okay, thank you very much. I was asked to speak about anti-Semitism in the Middle East, or as I prefer to call it, anti-Jewish hostility and persecution. And I will say a couple of things about that. But I do want to say that to begin by saying it's a rather, in a way, a peculiar topic for the reason that was mentioned by Bishop Warda, who, among other things, mentioned that there are no Jews left in Iraq, a community of about 100,000, 150,000 left within the space of a few years. And the situation is similar almost everywhere in the Middle East. In a few countries, there's a handful of thousands, but mostly there are no Jews in Syria, no Jews, of course, in Saudi Arabia and so forth. So the Jewish issue has been, in a certain way, solved or concentrated in the issue of the State of Israel. That's where the question lies, except from the point of view of the overall sensibility within the Middle East of deep and abiding hostility to Jews. I want to say, I want to interrupt my remarks about this to say that I very much hope that Bishop Warda's appeal will be heeded concerning 390 and the good work it might still do in northern Iraq. I've been there and can certainly use the work that 390 will permit, so that there's a chance what couldn't be done for the Jews in the region might still be done for Christians and other minorities. And especially to, in a certain way, not only to restore people to their homes, but to establish the principle that they're entitled to be there. They're just entitled to be there. What to say about anti-Semitism in the Middle East? It's an enormously large topic, so let me boil it down to a couple of things. It has 2 major causes, one ancient and one modern. The ancient one are the kinds of things that are to be found in Muslim texts which I think Christina just referred, which also applied to Christians. The modern cause is something that was new to the Muslim world in the last couple of centuries, and that is failure, deep and profound failure from the point of view of the worldly situation of Muslims. And there were two ways to go with this, this experience of failure. One was to sort of ask oneself, well, why did we fail? What can we do about it? The other was to find fault with everyone else. And unfortunately, it's a very great human temptation to find fault with everyone else and not to face one's own responsibility for one's situation. And that is what has occurred in a whole variety of ways, and not only with Jews, but it takes the form of what's called conspiracy theories. The situation of Muslims is said by Muslims to be the result of conspiracies, Jewish conspiracies, Western conspiracies, Christian conspiracies. And the Jewish conspiracy is particularly important, I think. The notion of it is important because it was fairly bearable for, I think, Muslim sensibility that, well, somehow the Christians would get the upper hand or Western countries would get the upper hand, but that Jews would come back into political existence and have a state and have an army and fight wars and occasionally win them. This just doesn't compute. This really doesn't compute and seems to be something that requires a very strange explanation. And the explanation that Muslims have come up with are conspiracy theories of one sort or another. Some of them borrowed actually from European conspiracy theories. I want to conclude by saying, well, what can one do about this and its impact on religious freedom? And the answer is, it's very complicated for the obvious reason that it requires real soul searching on the part of Muslim majorities, and requires even sectarian soul searching on the part of Shia and Sunnis with respect to one another. One thing that I think this legislation, your commission, and all of these efforts can do is to say that others care and feel they have a stake in this. There are different ways the forms this could take. I mean, Iran, for the moment, is the greatest enemy, the greatest threat to Jewish existence in the Middle East. Speaks of it openly as a cancerous tumor, meaning it must be excised and cut out. I hope it won't succeed, but whether it succeeds or not is going to depend upon how Israel can defend itself and how much others, outsiders, will see its need to defend itself. But with respect to other situations, this country is always faced with these choices. How deeply do we get involved? Because in every one of these cases, since it involves minorities, but native minorities, it can be described, and frequently is, as a civil war. Not a genocide, but a civil war. They're just fighting, except that the Yazidis have no weapons, nor do the Christians in Erbil. So we have a distaste, as our former president said, for getting involved in other people's civil wars. And there's an argument to be made for that. But if we're going to do something about this, we're going to have to seriously consider that that can't be definitive.
Thank you. Well, Paul, you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. Our focus is on the Middle East, but I've been asked particularly to look at Middle East influences from the Middle East, which undercut religious freedom, particularly the position of minorities in other parts of the world. So I will do that, especially with reference to the world's largest Muslim majority country, Indonesia. Just a historical note. After 9/11, some 17 years ago, I found myself being asked questions about terrorism, which was not a subject that I had studied particularly. But one thing I had been working on for a long time was religious freedom issues in places such as Nigeria or Kenya or Somalia or Indonesia. And if you do that, you come across terrorists who are responsible for much of that. And so I remember vividly a major newspaper headline in 2002 after remember the bombings in Bali in Indonesia, over 200 people were killed. There was a big headline that says, terrorism comes to Indonesia. I wrote a follow-up article, put briefly, it says, you can only say it comes to Indonesia if you ignore the 8,000 people, Indonesians, already killed by Laskar Jihad and other organizations who've been doing this for years. So there one sees already examples of a pernicious influence. Let me say more particularly on Indonesia. And while there are other sources, I'll also focus particularly on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a variety of baleful influences in Indonesia. One Christina has already pointed out is the use of textbooks or the funding of mosques. Funding is very hard to trace, but there are at least 150 Saudi-funded mosques in Indonesia. You have a completely Saudi-funded university, Lipia, the Institute for the Study of Islam and Arabic. It's an interesting place. It's right in the heart of the capital, Jakarta. And men and women are segregated, and certain things are forbidden. Loud laughter is forbidden, music is forbidden, television is forbidden, and the Indonesian language is forbidden. You cannot speak that on campus in the middle of the country. So many graduates from this university have had bad influences in Indonesia. Let me just deal with 3 recent incidents. One was a case that very unusually, 2 years ago, 16 of the major Muslim organizations in Indonesia asked the government to request the expulsion of the Saudi Arabian religious attaché, which happened. This was done quietly, but it meant the religious attaché had been even more aggressive than had been usual. A second one, something you would know about, you might remember that last year, the ethnic Chinese Christian governor of Jakarta, the capital, in the middle of the election campaign was accused of blasphemy, was subsequently convicted and sent to prison for 2 years. He's due out this month. And the chief ringleader organizing demonstrations and raising concerns about Ahok, the governor, was himself charged and is charged with a variety of things, including pornography. You can actually, if you're interested, you can go to his Snapchat account and find those things. Anyway, he's been hiding out in Saudi Arabia for the last 18 months, and he's still there. And then Indonesia is now in a midst of a presidential election due in April. And when it mentioned the charges of blasphemy in the governor's race last year, this was widely considered, I think correctly, also to be a dry run for the presidential election. And we use religion to stir people up and get conflict, in particular with blasphemy accusations. And the first of these surfaced 7 weeks ago. I was actually quite close to what was going on. But a group of Muslim youth burned the flag of Hizb ut-Tahrir. Hizb ut-Tahrir is an illegal organization in Indonesia, showing its flag is illegal. However, the flag does have the Shahada on it. So if you burn it, you're burning a Quranic verse. So this created all sorts of controversy, and the Saudi Arabian ambassador waded in on this and said people who did it were members of a deviant organization. Well, the people who did it were part of the youth group of Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the world's largest Muslim organization. And they have created a fuss. And 6 days ago, the Indonesian government called in the Saudi ambassador who had waded in on this issue and reprimanded him for his statements. So those are a variety of small incidents, but giving, well, Lasker Jihad and so on is larger incidents. But you see this continuing influence and stirring, creating of opposition and anger and division, and particularly an increasingly stronger theme there, antagonism to minorities, including Muslim minorities. So these are some examples there of what is happening. Just one suggestion already touched on. We very much have Saudi Arabia on our minds right now because of the murder of Khashoggi. But two things to raise in concerns if there's leverage with Saudi Arabia. One already mentioned is the textbooks. But the other one, which many people have been doing for years, is curtailing these sorts of influences in other parts of the Muslim world. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much. And thank you to each of the panelists. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to sort of expedite the questions for each of the panelists, and I think I'm just going to abbreviate it. So if the panel will indulge me, we're going to limit the number of questions asked. And Christina, with respect to the Saudi textbooks, what are the steps the U.S. government should take, in your estimation, to correct this?
Yeah, well, we have very many powerful tools that have been given by the United States Congress, such as the Global Magnitsky Act. We should be looking at targeted sanctions against Saudi Arabia and any other country. And we certainly could demand that Saudi Arabia retract or buy back all of the books that they have spread throughout the third world. Yeah.
Thank you. Paul, with respect to blasphemy, again, what are your recommendations that the U.S. government should take to correct those and influence countries using blasphemy as a tool of persecution?
Okay, firstly, at home, resist any attempts to limit religious insult by law.
You mean here?
Here in the United States, right? Yep. Because there's worries about that. Also in the international system, the United Nations, and in other Western countries, there's a great worry. Nina and I co-wrote a book called Silenced, which is, I think, still the largest survey of blasphemy and related laws in the world. There's a great danger of these things coming into the West, including the decision of the European Court on Human Rights 2 to 3 weeks ago, which held that, put briefly, in this context, insulting Islam, limiting speech insulting Islam would not be considered a violation of human rights. So we need to look at home. Situations are worse elsewhere. To continually raise the dangers of blasphemy laws, and what is more dangerous is not the laws, it's the private accusations. Nobody in Pakistan has been executed for blasphemy in the modern age. Hundreds of people get killed by mobs, they get killed in prison and so on. So, and to point out that in no case, in no country that I know of has have blasphemy laws been limited to what they ostensibly are, insults to God or a prophet. People who disagree, people who argue with the government, people who have a different interpretation of religion, Islam or whatever, Sunni versus Shiite, and you throw in Ahmadis into that, you throw in Baha'is into that. In every case, blasphemy laws just run out their bounds and cause massive destruction. And to keep pointing this out to people that you will not even achieve your purpose of stopping people insulting God. You will make the situation worse and you will create conflict.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth, and then I'll go to Hillel. Elizabeth, what should the federal government be doing to be more vigilant on the emergence of genocide in its early stages, if you will?
I think pay more attention to the kinds of nonviolent tools that I just talked about. We've spent a lot of time talking about education and textbooks. I think that's one. I think destruction of sites. We spoke earlier with the USERF about the importance of ensuring that there is preservation and protection of cultural and religious sites. We signed bilateral memoranda of understanding with countries that include, in fact, cultural heritage protection. So in those cases, I think we should insist upon the fact that the communities whose religious and cultural heritage is being obliterated or appropriated and written as somebody else's history, that those communities are represented in any kind of assistance that we give for cultural heritage protection. And then finally, the use of forensic and digital tools to digitize manuscripts that are in danger of being eliminated or that are targeted, and also forensic tools for identifying sites that have been attacked and turned into other religious sites, churches turned into mosques, churches turned into latrines and stables, and the same holds true for anybody's religious sites. But we can use digital and forensic evidence, and we can fund the use of those tools in order to preserve.
Thank you. And then lastly, Hillel, hopefully on a positive note, can you identify or at least describe emerging Muslim leaders who are fighting anti-Semitism?
Yes, there are people who are beginning to fight in a certain way. Recently, I believe the Sultan of Oman made a public speech to the effect that his colleagues in the Middle East have to get over Israel and just realize it's a fact of life and part of the region. That's a kind of step. I mentioned that not because one might suppose that the best efforts one could find would be ones which involve a kind of theological transformation in the perspective of Islamic doctrine. And I'm familiar with some such efforts, and I participated in some, mostly with my colleague Hussein Haqqani, Ambassador Haqqani, who is such a voice. But always, as I implied before, the hurdle that this effort has to overcome is the hurdle of facing one's own responsibility. And among the things that I see being said these days is, we wasted an enormous amount of time hating Israel and Jews. And in the meantime, our region has gotten worse and worse. Our countries have gotten worse and worse. We have civil wars that kill half a million people. If that's the beginning of wisdom. It's not wisdom itself, but it's the beginning of wisdom.
May I add something positive at the end?
Christina, bring it on.
Yes. So one of the great privileges of working at the Commission, working with people who have been told no a million times. And that was the first indicator that was a good idea. Two of them are Gary Barr and Tony Perkins, who have been fighting for our rights in the United States for some time. But I also want to invite young people to join this. I think there is a great fear of failure and a great fear of being told no. If you hear that no, the quicker it is, the faster you have to decide that that's an invitation for you to figure it out, that it's actually a great idea. And I think all of us who have been veterans of the no's turn into triumphant yeses, sometimes it took a few years, please be courageous. Don't let anyone silence you, not petty bureaucrats, not people who are easily offended. Don't believe everything you think. And make sure that you understand that what you're doing is, we live in an easy world in the United States. There are people like Archbishop here who are suffering for this every day. We are their voices when they can't speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Hillel, we need to wrap it up if that's okay. So thank you, Paul, Hillel, Christina, Elizabeth, and Nina for your work today.
Thank you.
What I wanted to do was say...
You can introduce
us. So we have one final speaker, and if the panel... Well, you can stay here.
Oh,
get
okay.
Ringside seat. So it's my pleasure to welcome Katrina Lentos Sweat, the president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, and importantly, she has been the former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Katrina.
Thank you so much. Well, I am honored
to be here in a room full of so many people that I admire and whose work I have learned from, and I feel sort of at whose feet I have studied. There are great friends right here on this panel, especially these three powerhouse women who are just extraordinary. And, one of the interesting things about the fight for international religious freedom is that it is not only a fight often led by women, but it is a fight that benefits women in every potential struggling society of the world. And that's, I think, a sort of sidebar message that we need to do a better job communicating, because there is this default assumption in the minds of many people: religion, women's oppression. And what we know and what the evidence indicates is, of course, just the opposite, that those societies that do a robust job of protecting international religious freedom are also societies where women have higher socioeconomic status, more opportunity, more protection. There are a couple of people I see in the audience who are dear personal friends. Alex Arriaga, who worked for a number of years for my late father, and the two, gorgeous Arriagas together here today. And it's so lovely to see you, and my dear friend, almost like a member of the family, Connie Wilson here in the first row. But honestly, I could go row by row. I feel that way about so many of you. And so thank you, Nina, for allowing me to be here with you today. Tom Farr, of course, a hero and a giant in this movie. I better stop, because you know what? If I don't stop, then I'm just going to have to keep going one by one. I have a few remarks I'd like to share with you. Today's program underscores an important fact, and that is we only know where we need to go if we know where we came from. And thanks to this extraordinary retrospective, a copy of which I think all of you either already have or will be receiving, and the conversations that have taken place today around the 20th commemorative anniversary of the passage of Urfa, we are reminded of the really heroic story of how we got to where we are today. The brave and visionary people who understood that what is in fact the bedrock human right, the wellspring human right, had somehow, over time, not in the Universal Declaration, but in the practice of human rights on a day in, day out basis, had been somehow sidelined, had become something of an orphan, a little bit forgotten. And they understood that not only was this unacceptable from a moral perspective, but it was foolish and self-defeating from a very practical perspective. And so I see one of the heroes back there who I neglected to mention earlier, of course, Congressman Frank Wolf, without whom none of us would be here. Are we not today gathered in the house that Frank Wolf built? And please, Frank, please stand up so we can acknowledge you. Thank you so much. I often refer to him as a Daniel. I know he got the Daniel Award a few years ago. Can't imagine a more suitable recipient of such a powerfully named award, but somebody who has never feared to go into the lion's den. And by the way, I'll just mention parenthetically that when you look through your beautiful copy of this fantastic report, you'll see some pretty good-looking, sexy pictures of Frank as a slightly younger guy. So, I'm just saying you might want to get your pens and have him autograph your copy of the report before he slips away, the silver fox. But it is a fantastic story. It's a story of hope and glory and inspiration and courage, and it's told here, and it's one that we should feel very, very good about. But what I love about this anniversary retrospective is that it is also full of challenge, because we have done some things extraordinarily well, and those things we should be proud of. Urfa laid out a framework. It said that as a matter of law, not as a matter of policy, but as a matter of law, the United States would be committed to the pursuit and the advocacy and the defense of international religious freedom and fundamental conscience rights. And that's a huge achievement and extraordinarily important. It established entities and mechanisms to put meat on those bones. So we have an ambassador at large for religious freedom. And if I'm not mistaken, Ambassador Brownback, was here earlier today. And, you know, our immediate preceding ambassador at large was a phenomenally effective and powerful voice. And now we have another effective and powerful voice, somebody who sort of brings that bit of added energy and drama that former politicians sometimes have to sort of put a little bit of oomph and pizzazz behind this very important advocacy. And we have the office that enables the IRF ambassador to do their important work. We have USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which Christina described so well, with really dedicated public servants devoting their time as volunteers to be able to do what sometimes the IRF ambassador isn't able to do. The thing that I loved about my time serving on USCIRF was that because we were independent, bipartisan, and weren't really, in some senses, part of the government, we had more running room than anybody at the State Department can ever have. How many people here have ever worked at or been part of the State Department? Okay, I see a few hands go up. Wonderful place. Important. It does so much of the vital work of how we interact with the world. But boy, is it bureaucratic. Boy, is it tough. I mean, you can barely, get permission to say Gesundheit without getting 10 people to first sign off on it and sanitize it and make sure that, it's not going to push the wrong button here or there. But USCIRF, that glorious independence that USCIRF has, gives it the sort of running room to call a spade, to say sometimes what needs to be said, to designate countries as countries of particular concern that the State Department doesn't have the freedom to do the same thing about. And so I often said, and not just as a means of self-promotion, when I was at USCIRF, that we are the gold standard. And our report was the gold standard because we could afford to be a little more fearless. And I don't think there are any of the talented USCIRF staff or USCIRF past and present commissioners who haven't gotten the occasional frantic phone call from our friends at the State Department saying, you can't do that. Stop right now. And as my darling Hungarian mother would sometimes say, because my late father, he liked to royal things at the State Department as well. He was, he had that independence too as an individual member of Congress. And she would tell me, well, when the State Department calls, your father just tells them to go fly a kite. And USCIRF sometimes had that ability to say, you know what? Go fly a kite. Pakistan does deserve to be a country of particular concern, and we're going to call it out as such. And so IRFA was the mechanism that created these entities and this structure and these pods of power, if you will, to make this issue real, to put meat on the bones, to give us annual reports. And those reports, sometimes here in Washington, a city awash in a lot of really important and substantive and powerful reports, we might shrug our shoulders and say, it's just another report. But I witnessed personally, I'm sure my current and past people who are our colleagues in the sense that we've both served on USCIRF have experienced as well how meaningful of a tool that is to people in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. They have the imprimatur of the United States government on a document that tells the truth about what they are going to, that calls out the perpetrators, that lays it out there. And not only does it give them a sense of moral support and that they aren't alone and that the terrible things they are enduring are known and are being reported on by those with credibility, it gives them a small measure of added protection. Not much, not what we wish we could, but it always gives a small measure of added protection to those who are on the front lines and are at the mercy of abusive governments. So there's an awful lot to be proud of and to be grateful for as we celebrate this 20-year notable anniversary. But, and this is what I also love about this retrospective, it points the way towards where we need to go from here. One of the things, of course, we don't want to change is the proud tradition of bipartisanship in the effort and the struggle for religious freedom. I have been so saddened and dismayed to see the way domestically issues around religious freedom have become a source of such division. It's just like stabs me in the heart every single time I hear someone, too often from my side of the aisle in my party, say religious freedom and add scare quotes around it as though somehow that very phrase has become suspect. That's wrong. It's wrong for us domestically, but it is atrociously wrong when we are talking about the struggle for religious freedom internationally. And thank goodness, at least till now, this has remained a largely bipartisan cause. And that in and of itself is practically a religious miracle in today's Washington. And that's something, of course, we have to work hard to defend. But as I look at the next 10 years, as I look at the landscape that lies ahead, I see two important challenges that I think we can meet and that I think we must meet. The first is that I really think we're still waiting for a breakthrough with a sort of critical mass of top leadership in the executive branch, in Congress, to recognize that international religious freedom is not just a nice idea, sort of a desiderata. If we put together our list of things that in our ideal world we would kind of like to see happen, let's add religious freedom to that. No, religious freedom, the defense of conscience rights, is, in my opinion, intimately interwoven with our most hard-edged national security concerns. If you look at those countries that pose some of the gravest risks from the perspective of terrorism, violence, social upheaval, incubators for all of the worst things that threaten our hard-edged national interests, they are always, okay, you should never say always, they are almost always societies in which fundamental freedom of religion, conscience, and belief is constrained, repressed, restricted. It is the ultimate marker of a mature society, a society that can be a productive part of the world community, that they make space for all people of all faiths and of no faiths to equally share the public square, to have equal protection and respect within that community. And so I really hope, and when I was on USERF, it was I didn't want to become a Johnny One Note, but it was my constant plea when I would meet with lawmakers on the Hill to see this not as, just sort of a nice idea, and we trot it out. Once a year we put out a statement, but it's not really central to America's mission in the world. It's not central to American security. It's not central to advancing our interests. I want them to come to see the defense and the advance of fundamental conscience rights globally as central to our national security, the advance of American interests in every corner of the world. The second big challenge that I think lies ahead, and this is very much referenced in this wonderful, really outstanding report. I tip my hat to the authors and those of you who have worked on it because it's outstanding. It's not just another report, but they touch upon the need to take this movement to the next step in terms of broadening and engaging a much, much larger community. The fun thing about being involved in the international religious freedom world is we all kind of know each other. It's almost like, old home day or a college reunion, but that's not good. I want to come to events where I have no idea who these dozens and hundreds of people are, because we have gone beyond this small visionary band of brave souls who get it. And that we haven't done yet. And I think one of the mysteries to me, and we have to crack this code, we have to figure out how to break through here, is that we have not done a better job of engaging communities of faith on behalf of their co-religionists. I'm the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and I was quite young at the time, but I remember vividly the movement to free Soviet Jewry. It was huge. It became it became a big, big movement, one that couldn't be ignored, one that forced itself to the top of the agenda of people who had nothing really personally to do with the Jewish community. They may not have even been, religious themselves. They might not have been that interested in foreign policy or foreign affairs. But that movement gained the sort of traction that everybody knew about it. And a lot of people cared about it. It became much, much bigger than the little community of persecuted people it was directed towards helping. Another example of a cause that achieved that level of social currency was the very powerful and important movement to end apartheid in South Africa, which of course was also led by many, many people of faith. And if you study a little bit about that movement to end apartheid in South Africa, you see how the leaders of the African American community and civil rights community and religious community really went to school on the lessons learned by the Soviet Jewry movement. And they took it to the next level with creative new ideas and revisioning how they could break through. And we know and how extraordinary it is to be able to say, they did it. They did it. That's actually one of those rare moments, and the Soviet Jewry movement is the same one, where we can point to a moment in time and say, yes, mission accomplished. Mission accomplished in the sense that apartheid did come to an end in South Africa. Even powerful forces, I remember President Reagan was president during the period of the passage of the South Africa Sanctions Bill, the Anti-Apartheid Act. And he vetoed it. He was a popular president. He vetoed it. And he had, very sincere reasons for doing so. At the time, he said, he thought that this would hurt the very people it was designed to help. And there were other mechanisms and quiet diplomacy and this and that. And those of you who have been on the Hill or around the Hill for a long time, you know how extraordinarily difficult it is to override a presidential veto. It's really tough. And especially when it is a charismatic and well-liked president. And if I'm not mistaken, President Reagan actually went, on national television to deliver, an address to sort of explain why he was vetoing this bill. But Congress mustered the wherewithal to override that veto. And it made all the difference in the world. And we could actually see that one evil removed from the world as a result of this movement. Now, the nature of religious freedom abuses is so widespread and so many tentacled, if you will, that I don't know that the day will come when we can say, aha, that was the moment. That was the moment when it ended. That was the moment of total victory. But I do believe, and I do feel a great conviction, that if we can marshal and summon a similar level of viral energy, of grassroots energy, engaging faith communities, engaging young people. I think it was Christina who talked about the importance of engaging young people, that we can see this movement taken to a very different level. And I actually think we would be doing our own very divided and very riven society a huge advantage if we were to do so, because this is a cause that people of left and right, faith and no faith, Republicans and Democrats really can passionately come together around. And that is a mitzvah right there. When you bring people together who are otherwise hiding behind their respective barricades and totally not only prepared, but frankly eager to think the worst about those on the other side of the barricades. If you can bring them together on something where their interests are common, their passions are common, and their goals are common, they will have to begin to see each other through different eyes. And maybe, just maybe, we can find a better way forward. I'd like to close today with a story, and some of you may have heard me tell this before, so I apologize if you have, but it's one that is very dear to my heart, and that's the story of John Wycliffe, the English theologian and preacher and reformer who, in the late 1200s, undertook to translate the Bible from the Latin Vulgate into the common vernacular. This was a very contested and controversial thing to do at that time in history, and he faced enormous opposition and even persecution from the ecclesiastical authorities of his day. But he persisted in this mission he felt called to complete. And when he had finished, he wrote the following words in the flyleaf of that first translation. He wrote, "The translation is complete and shall make possible government of the people, by the people, and for the people." Now, we think of that unforgettable phrase as deriving from our own remarkable President Lincoln in a time of great difficulty for our nation, delivered at the site of the terrible Battle of Gettysburg when he delivered the Gettysburg Address. But it has a much more ancient patrimony. We can't know for sure what Wycliffe meant or what his intention was when he wrote those words. But I believe he was elucidating for all of us that when people are free to seek truth for themselves, directly for themselves, they become empowered to create societies that protect the conscience rights of all people. Thank you very much.
What a wonderfully optimistic and inspiring note to conclude on. And I want to thank Ambassador Brownback and Archbishop Warda and Frank Wolf, of course, who brought us all together today. Tom Gallagher, Lou, Aaron, and my co-panelists, thank you all for coming. Thank you, audience, for listening, and for many of, practically all of you, as I look around, are engaged in this field one way or another. Thank you for your work, too.